What if the very thing you believed made you kind was actually the mask that was silently breaking you? This is the paradox that many empaths eventually face. For years they endure, forgive, and excuse behavior that chips away at their soul, all under the illusion that patience and compassion are their greatest strengths. Yet the moment they stop endlessly forgiving, something profound happens. Every mask begins to fall, and the world they once thought was held together by love reveals an unsettling truth. The people who appeared loving suddenly show how much they relied on manipulation. The relationships that seemed to be built on kindness expose hidden exploitation. And in the quiet space after the last apology is withheld, the empath discovers that the greatest mask was not worn by others at all, but by themselves. It was the mask of endless forgiveness, crafted out of fear and maintained out of habit, a mask that slowly eroded their sense of self. Carl Jung believed that masks, or personas, are necessary for survival, but when they dominate, they become prisons. For the empath, the prison was made of smiles, nods, and silences that concealed their real feelings. To forgive without pause was not an act of strength, but of self-abandonment. The soul becomes thin when it is stretched across everyone else's needs while its own cries go unheard. And yet, there is power in this breaking point. When the mask falls, the empath does not become less loving, but more real. They begin to see with clarity, to separate genuine care from disguised control, and to reclaim the pieces of themselves they once surrendered. What if, in refusing to forgive endlessly, the empath finally steps into the most authentic love of all, the love that begins with themselves? What if the thing that made you feel the most loving was actually the thing that kept you trapped the longest? Many empaths spend their lives believing that their ability to endlessly forgive is a sign of strength, spirituality, or moral superiority. But beneath the softness often hides a wound, a deep, unspoken fear that if they stop forgiving, they will lose everything: family, friends, peace, love. This fear doesn't arrive from nowhere. It is carved in childhood, where survival often depended on being the good one, the peacemaker, the one who didn't make things worse. So the child learned to silence their pain with a smile, to trade their truth for approval, to survive by staying silent. And eventually this pattern becomes a personality. In Jungian psychology, this is not kindness. This is a complex, wounded identity organized around self-erasure. Jung taught that many behaviors we label as virtues are actually defensive patterns rooted in early fear. Endless forgiveness, then, is not always love. It is often fear dressed in politeness. The fear of conflict, the fear of abandonment, the fear of being unloved if we finally say, enough. When empaths apologize just to keep the peace, accept mistreatment to avoid confrontation, or feel guiltier for creating boundaries than for enduring harm, they are not practicing compassion. They are unconsciously betraying their own soul. This betrayal accumulates over time. You see it in the woman who keeps inviting her mother back into her life, despite years of emotional abuse, because she's still my mom. You hear it in the man who lets his partner belittle him, because she's been through a lot. You feel it in the friend who says yes to every demand, then collapses alone, drained and resentful. These are not small moments. They are quite funerals for the authentic self. Jung called this the great loss, when a person forfeits their inner truth in exchange for acceptance by others. But there is a hidden cost to this survival strategy. It fractures the psyche. The shadow, the repressed parts of ourselves that hold anger, assertiveness, self-worth, begins to grow restless. We begin to feel exhausted, bitter, unseen. This is not a sign that we are failing. It is a sign that the mask is cracking. The soul is tired of self-sacrifice as a currency for belonging. The real turning point comes when we begin to ask, why do I keep forgiving what still wounds me? Why do I feel unsafe when I finally speak up? When did my value become measured by my ability to endure pain? These are not accusations. They are awakenings. They pull us inward into the basement of the unconscious, where the truth waits like a buried treasure. You were never meant to sacrifice your wholeness for someone else's comfort. Healing begins here, not in more tolerance, but in less self-abandonment. Not in more giving, but in remembering that your own needs matter too. As Jung wrote, the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Endless forgiveness ends when self-acceptance begins. When you finally give yourself permission to stop bleeding for others, you do not become cruel, you become whole. So the question becomes, what would love look like if you included yourself in it? What happens when you stop playing the role they fell in love with? The answer is unsettling. Everything begins to fall apart, not because you did something wrong, but because you stopped being who you never were. When an empath stops endlessly forgiving, they unknowingly trigger a collapse, not just in their relationships, but in the entire psychic ecosystem that was silently feeding off their compliance. The emotional contracts, once signed in silence, are ripped up the moment they reclaim their voice. Friends grow cold, partners become distant, family members guilt-trip them with phrases like, "You've changed." But the truth is, they are finally returning to themselves. This collapse is not just relational, it is internal. For years, empaths learned to suppress anger, to swallow grief, to minimize betrayal. They called it grace. They called it maturity. But underneath it was fear. Fear of being rejected, misunderstood, or called too much. This emotional repression forms what Carl Jung called the shadow, the collection of all we deny, suppress, and exile from our conscious identity. And for empaths, this shadow is not full of evil. It is full of unmet needs, unexpressed truths, and unclaimed power. Jung taught that we do not become enlightened by imagining light, but by making the darkness conscious. That is why the collapse is sacred. It is the descent that must occur for rebirth. Suddenly, empaths are forced to face the parts of themselves they abandoned, the version of them that is allowed to say no, to be angry without guilt, to walk away without explanation. This confrontation feels violent because it is the first time they let themselves feel. It is the death of performance and the birth of authenticity. Imagine a woman who has always been the peacekeeper, the emotional balm in every room. When she finally sets a boundary with her mother, the phone stops ringing. When she stops over-functioning in her marriage, her husband calls her selfish. The collapse is real, but so is the emergence. For the first time, she sees clearly. Her love was used as currency, her silence mistaken for peace, her forgiveness exploited as a free pass. And now the shadow speaks, not to destroy, but to integrate. Inside the shadow lives sacred anger, not the rage that lashes out, but the fire that protects. Their lives are healthy selfishness, not ego, but the instinct that says, "I matter too." There lives the true boundary, not a wall of punishment, but a gate of discernment. As the empath begins to integrate these parts, they stop apologizing for needing space. They stop over-explaining why they're hurt. They no longer collapse every time someone withdraws love as a form of punishment. The hardest part of this journey is not losing others, it is losing the false self, the version who tolerated too much, who spiritualized their own suffering, who wore humility like a muzzle. That mask is heavy, and when it finally slips, the empath is left raw, real, and radically awake. What rises from this fall is not a bitter heart, but a clarified one that no longer mistakes harmony for health or silence for love. So the question becomes, what have you suppressed to keep others comfortable? And what would happen if, just once, you let your truth speak louder than your fear? But here's what no one tells you. Sometimes the greatest betrayal isn't what someone did to you. It's what you allowed to happen because you couldn't bear to lose them. How many moments did you swallow your voice just to keep the peace? How many boundaries did you blur because you mistook pain for passion? And how many nights did you lie awake trying to figure out if it was love or just your fear of being abandoned dressed up as devotion? You didn't just love them, you made them your compass. You silenced your inner voice just to stay connected to someone who had long stopped hearing you. That is the wound most people carry in silence, the wound of self-abandonment masquerading as loyalty. Because when love is confused with survival, the psyche adapts in twisted ways. You learn to read their moods like weather forecasts, trying to predict the next emotional storm so you can avoid the fallout. You become hyper-aware, not because you're intuitive, but because your nervous system has become a battleground. You call it chemistry. But it's trauma bonding. You call it intuition. But it's hypervigilance. You call it destiny. But it's just the unconscious seeking what is familiar. What we don't realize is that the soul doesn't just attract what it wants. It attracts what it believes it deserves. And until we change that inner belief, we are condemned to repeat the same patterns with different faces, hoping for different endings. Now here's the deeper truth. The reason we stay, even when we know we're breaking, isn't because we're weak. It's because we're still trying to heal something older than this person. In Jungian psychology, this is the shadow of our unmet childhood needs, the unspoken wound that says, if I can just make this person love me, I will finally prove I was never unworthy. And so, we fight, we chase, we beg, not because we need them, but because we need the emotional resolution they symbolize. They are not just a person, they are an unconscious symbol of our inner split. That is why their absence feels like death, not because they are our oxygen, but because we attached our very identity to their approval. And this is the moment of reckoning, when you stop asking, why did they leave me? And instead ask, why did I keep abandoning myself just to be chosen? This is the breaking point that feels like hell, but becomes holy. This is when the soul, exhausted from begging, finally turns inward. When the chase ends, the grief begins. But it's not just grief for them. It's grief for all the times you silenced yourself, for the child in you who learned that love must be earned through sacrifice, for the years you mistook your suffering as proof of your loyalty. And in that grief, you begin to see clearly. They were not your soulmate. They were your soul mirror, and what they reflected back to you wasn't just their inability to love you, it was your forgotten ability to love yourself. So when the silence comes after the storm, let it stay, let it speak, let it name every place where your spirit was shrinking for someone who never truly saw you, because of that ache in your chest. That's not the echo of missing them, that's the sound of your soul returning home. Have you ever felt like everything familiar is crumbling around you, not because something went wrong, but because something inside you refused to keep pretending? This is the silent earthquake that no one sees coming. One morning, you wake up, and the conversations that once comforted you now feel like noise. The friends who used to understand you begin to call you distant, too serious, or no fun anymore. Your family accuses you of becoming someone they no longer recognize, and the relationship you once clung to for survival starts to feel like a graveyard of who you used to be. But what if all of this isn't a sign that you're breaking down, but waking up? Carl Jung referred to this stage as the dark night of the soul. Not because it is evil, but because it is essential. It is the sacred unraveling, the shedding of every false identity you once wore just to be loved, accepted, or safe. And it doesn't come gently. It comes when you stop lying to yourself. It comes when the pain of staying the same finally becomes greater than the fear of change. Suddenly, the roles you've played, caretaker, peacemaker, overachiever, martyr, start to feel like masks suffocating your spirit. And when you dare to take them off, even for a breath, the people who benefited from your silence will call it betrayal. This stage can feel like social death. You're not just letting go of a person, you're letting go of your role in their story. And without that role, some people no longer know how to love you. This is the cold truth most people avoid. Real healing often costs you the life you built on your wounds. You might lose invitations. You might sit alone at family dinners. You might scroll past birthdays you were once part of. But solitude is not the absence of love. Sometimes it's the beginning of truth. It is in this darkness that the soul is no longer distracted. It begins to whisper what it really wants. And for the first time in decades, you might actually hear it. But transformation always asks for something in return, the death of who you thought you had to be. And that is terrifying, because no one teaches us how to grieve the loss of an identity. No one prepares us for the emptiness that follows when we stop being who others needed us to be. And yet, Jung reminds us, this descent into the underworld is not a punishment. It is an initiation. Like the ancient myths, you must journey into the belly of the beast, not to be devoured, but to retrieve what you left behind. Your fire, your voice, yourself. So, if you are in this phase, feeling like everything is falling apart, what if it's actually falling into place? What if the chaos isn't destruction, but reordering? What if the silence isn't abandonment, but space being cleared for the real you to finally speak? And most importantly, who might you become if you stopped asking for permission to be whole? What if forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, excusing, or reopening the door, but finally releasing what no longer belongs in your nervous system? After the collapse and dark night, something profound begins to shift in the empath. The ache to be understood softens. The need to prove innocence fades, and in its place, a new kind of clarity emerges, not born from fear or obligation, but from wisdom. The empath no longer confuses kindness with compliance. They stop forgiving out of habit and begin forgiving out of consciousness. This is not the kind of forgiveness taught in spiritual bypassing or toxic positivity. It is not the script of just let it go while your heart is still bleeding. It is not about rushing ahead of your pain to look virtuous. Conscious forgiveness does not begin until truth has been acknowledged, until boundaries have been spoken and respected, until the inner self feels safe again. It is not the absence of justice. It is the presence of deep alignment. Jung understood that only when we integrate the shadow, not suppress it, can true wholeness take root. And forgiveness, at this level, is not a gift you give the other person. It is a homecoming within yourself. In the real world, this shift is not theoretical. It shows up in the woman who finally stops answering texts from the friend who always needed saving and starts painting again, her colors finally returning. It lives in the father who no longer hides behind duty, but begins writing letters to the child he abandoned years ago, not for redemption, but for truth. It is felt in the man who forgives his ex, not by returning, but by no longer rehearsing the pain every night in his head. He puts the story down like a heavy coat. It's not about forgetting what happened. It's about refusing to carry what no longer belongs to you. And from this space, energy begins to return. Not the frenzied energy of overfunctioning or rescuing, but the steady, grounded force of someone who has returned to themselves. The empath begins investing in relationships that nourish rather than drain. They stop walking on eggshells to protect others from their own discomfort. They start showing up with clear eyes and open hearts, not because they owe it, but because they choose it. Love, for the first time, becomes an offering rather than a survival strategy. The most beautiful part? Creativity begins to bloom, because when guilt no longer governs your energy, imagination takes its place. You start dancing again, cooking again, dreaming again. Your life becomes your own canvas, not a reaction to someone else's story. And the body, once riddled with tension from holding unspoken pain, begins to breathe again. Healing becomes less about fixing and more about reclaiming. You no longer love from the wound, you love from the well. So ask yourself this: what would your life feel like if you no longer needed to make pain your permission slip for freedom? What might awaken in you if you stopped forgiving too soon and started forgiving only when your soul said yes? What if the most profound act of healing is not forgiving others, but finally forgiving yourself? After years of emotional labor, of holding the world together in silence, empaths often carry an invisible grief, a quiet self-blame for allowing the cycle to continue for so long. They replay the moments they stayed when they should have walked away, said yes when their souls screamed no, or confused chaos for passion and wounds for love. This isn't just regret. It is an ache that runs deeper than words. It is the silent guilt of betraying your own essence in the name of peace. But Carl Jung understood something revolutionary. Healing begins when we confront the part of us that was complicit in our own suffering, not with shame, but with radical compassion. He called this individuation the process of becoming whole, and wholeness includes both the naive parts that didn't know better and the wiser parts that now do. To forgive oneself is not to excuse the past, but to finally embrace the truth that every survival pattern had its purpose. You were not weak. You were loyal. You were not foolish. You were hopeful. And even if you lost yourself for a while, you were always trying to love. When an empath reaches this depth of self-forgiveness, something sacred shifts. The energy that once spiraled into self-doubt and rumination begins to flow upward, transforming into creative fire and quiet confidence. There is no longer a need to explain your heart to those who never valued it. There is no hunger to be seen by those who have only recognized your usefulness. You become the witness of your own becoming. You realize that the final liberation is not proving your worth, but reclaiming it from where you left it last, inside your own hands. This is not a quick moment. It unfolds slowly, like morning light after a long night. One day, you wake up and you do not ache anymore when their name passes through your memory. One day, you no longer rehearse the conversations where you finally said what you needed to. One day, you smile at the mirror, not for how others see you, but for how you see yourself, alive, whole, untamed. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." And this is what true forgiveness grants you. Not a return to how things were, but a release into who you are becoming. a person who can love without abandoning themselves, a soul who does not carry what is not theirs, a presence that no longer asks for permission to be radiant. In the end, the empath's healing does not come from the apology they never received, but from the moment they whispered to their younger self, "You did your best. I've got us now." And that voice, the one they use to quiet, to keep the peace, becomes the drumbeat of a new life, rooted not in sacrifice, but in sacred truth. So tell me, what would your life look like if you finally forgave yourself? If this touched something sacred inside you, don't let it fade into silence. Like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Your presence here is not just support, it's resonance. And if you feel moved to give back, your donation becomes a quiet but powerful gesture that helps keep this light alive for others still walking in the dark.